And then pastoring for about 13 years. We, 8 years ago, went out on the road to focus on the principles of freedom. And it's just it's an interesting calling, but it's so relevant. And the truth is, everything that's going on in our country has a spiritual foundation to it. And when it boils down to it, you're either for God or you're against God. And that plays out in your view of life, your worldview, your politics, all of it, because it's all connected to how you view life. So we are trying to encourage churches, number one, to understand the principles, which we'll go through a pretty interesting study here in just a minute. And then we're also encouraging believers not to give up, just to stand in there and understand that this battle has been going on for thousands of years, and it's just our turn. The whole idea of big government, overwhelming government, tyrannical government in opposition to God and God's people and even the individual. Under those systems, the individual really means nothing. But in God's system, the individual is everything because they're made in His image. They're His children. So it's really not that complicated, but it is, So I'll just tell you this quickly when I was pastoring, we did a Patriot Day rally down at the park, and it was all it was once a year was about getting as many quotes from the founders and the faith and the spiritual heritage that we have as Americans out to the average person who doesn't hear this kind of stuff anymore. And we did that 7 years, and that kind of led to us going out on the road to do this. And then that led to us, we moved to the Branson area because my parents had moved there. And we wanted to be close to them and my kids when we were off the road. They're all married now, by the way. I got 3 boys, 7 grandkids. My wife will show you pictures afterwards. But we landed in Branson. Then we had friends that had a small theater, and I was just burdened about maybe doing that rally in a theater, keeping that going business, getting your nose into that and all of that. Well, the truth is, as God's people, we understand God because you really, when you understand home, church, and government and what God intended, then you are going to do everything you can to help your nation stay on track and do the right thing. So with that as a foundation, we'll get into it, okay? He gave us the home in Genesis 2. But for about 1,500 years, mankind lived, right? This is the pre-flood world. Genesis 6, he says, in verse number 3, the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So he's coming to Noah, and he's saying, look, I'm going to destroy the world. Verse number 5, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. I underline the word wickedness. And that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I underlined only evil. If you go down to verse 11, the earth also was corrupt before God. I underline the word corrupt. And the earth was filled with violence. And then so I underline violence. Verse 12 says, God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Now that's quite an amazing description of the world, right? You've got 4 adjectives. It is evil, only evil continually. It is wicked, it is violent, and it is corrupt. Can you imagine living in a world like that? Well, it's getting easier and easier to imagine, isn't it? When mankind gets so perverted, so backwards, so far from God, so deceived, so dark that everything is evil continually. And evil has the idea that it's hurting others, okay? So anytime you see evil in the Bible, it's wrong, it's sin, but it's also hurtful. And that's good to keep in mind. So God says the world is past the point of no return. I mean, they are not going to have revival. They are so deep into their selfishness and their sin. They've rejected God. And it would be much better for the future if we just start over. So that's what he does, right? Noah builds the ark. They get on, 8 of them. They come off the other side of the ark. And God says, now, he's beginning to give Noah instructions. Go with me to Genesis 9. And he's going to tell Noah how the world's going to be from now on. It's going to be a little different. There's going to be the seasons and this and that. But then notice in verse number 6, God says, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. So part of his instructions to Noah, right when he gets off the ark, is, okay, from now on we're going to do things differently when someone kills someone. From now on, you are going to collectively come together and figure out a way to catch the murderer, make sure it was he that did it, and then take his life. Whoa. That's a big difference. Man didn't have that permission before. But now God says capital punishment, or taking the life of a murderer, is what I'm telling you to do. And that doesn't diminish the life of that murderer. It enhances the value of the life that was slaughtered, and it gives some sense of justice to the family who lost this person who was murdered. And it inhibits future murderers, right? Because from now on, if you're going to get mad and just kill somebody, you're going to stop and think, now wait, if I do this, they're all coming after me, and I'm dead. So it's a way to deter evil in the future, but it's also a way to execute justice on that murderer in this life. Before that, once you got past the authority structure of your family, you didn't have anyone to answer to, except for God at the great white throne or the judgment seat of Christ someday. And of course, they're living 900 years, you know. That's a long time to be evil and selfish, knowing that I'm not accountable to anyone until I die and stand before God someday. So God changed that, and he says, I'm instituting human government. Now, most scholars would agree Genesis 9:6 is where human government begins. So there's no government in Genesis 6. What did that world look like? It was horrible. Absolutely horrible. You talk about self-defense and needing a six-shooter on both hips and just living in fear because everyone was evil, everyone was wicked, and there was no 911. There's no one to call. You're on your own. Good luck, right? I mean, it was terrible. There's a word for that. It's called anarchy. In other words, there are no rules. I am my own boss. I'll do whatever I want. And if you get in my way, I'll hurt you or kill you. That's anarchy. No government. Now, some of these chop zones and Chaz zones that they were experimenting with, remember in Portland and Seattle and all, they're like, we don't need government. Government's the problem. Down with the police. Defund the police. I'm thinking, oh my goodness. The police are not the problem. Sin is the problem. Evil people are the problem. Now, if there's bad policemen, you get rid of them. But to say we don't need the police, I can already tell you where that's going to go. I've read Genesis 6. And sure enough, they blocked off, 10 city blocks or whatever and said, we don't want any police in here. Well, what happened? It degenerated. There was a few murders and rapes and theft, and there was nobody to call because they already said we don't want the police. And then it wasn't long before they were begging the police to come back in. Why? Because of our sin nature. We can't handle freedom. The truth is, true, like absolute freedom where you're just able to do whatever you want is destructive. Sooner or later, you will destroy yourself and the others around you. That's just sin. That's the sin nature. And it's because of sin. God didn't create governments in the first place, right? He created Adam and Eve and families. But it's when sin entered into the picture, it got so bad, then out of necessity, he instituted government. So, what is the purpose of government? You could sum up government's purpose, biblical purpose, in one word: protection. Really, and so, military is protecting us from evil outside of our borders, law enforcement, first responders protecting us from evil inside our borders, going after the bad guy so that you and I don't have to, so that we can go back and live our lives. But if someone commits evil, God said, I want you to organize and figure out a way to go after that evil guy and stop him from committing future murders and crimes, right? So this idea of government is not a bad thing. It's actually a needed thing. We need it. Try living without it. It's not going to be good. because of human nature. So if you notice Genesis 10, I'll just throw this in there real quick. The first mention of nations is in Genesis 10, verse 5. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families in their nations. So if you want to underline that, that's the first mention of nations. All a nation is a smaller group of people on the planet that are functioning together with civil law. So in other words, and nations were God's idea too, by the way. So to protest nations and say that nations are the problem and they're the reason for all the wars and the crime and all that. No, sin is the reason for wars and crime. The nations were also God's idea. And if you look at Genesis 11, you see the world's first tyrant in Nimrod. And this is where, does it even, I'm not sure. Well, actually, his name is mentioned over in Genesis 10. Look at verse number 8. Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. If you look into the Hebrew word there for mighty hunter, tyrant is in the definition. Nimrod is the one who built the Tower of Babel. He was the one that God had said, spread out, fill the earth, replenish. And Nimrod said, no, we're staying right here. We're building this tower. We're defying God. According to Josephus, the reason he built the tower was that if God should ever judge the world again with the flood, they would be able to escape it. It's an interesting take. And that was 2,000 years ago. That's what Josephus said about Nimrod. That was the Jewish understanding of this whole Tower of Babel, that we're going to build it so high into the heavens, if God ever dares to judge us, we will escape. So whatever happened there at Babylon or Babel, God had to judge it. And the way God judged it, instead of just wiping out Nimrod, he confused the languages. Isn't that interesting? So now instead of the whole world speaking one language, now we speak hundreds of languages. And the truth is, evolution has no explanation for why we would speak multiple languages, let alone hundreds of them. They've got 10 theories or so. They can't figure out. None of them really make sense. But you look at the Bible, it tells us exactly. God did that in an instant. Why would God confuse the languages at the Tower of Babel? Because it forced us, according to Genesis 11, to scatter out and to have smaller communities. It also made it that much harder for one leader, one king, one dictator, tyrant to rule the whole world. Because now, even if he defeats those people, there's this language barrier. It's going to be very difficult to govern them. And it was actually a safety mechanism built in for us that we could have local governments. Because in the Bible, local government is always better than global government. And the only time you see global government, it's bad. Whether it's Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar or the Antichrist, until Jesus comes. Now, when Jesus comes, it's going to be good. But as far as man's concerned, global government's not as good as local government. We can make our decisions better right here than somebody on the other side of the planet that doesn't even know us or speak our language, right? And so God forced everyone to spread out. The first mention, so Genesis 6, there's no government. Genesis 9, first mention of government. Genesis 10, the first mention of nations. Genesis 11, 10 and 11 is Nimrod in the Tower of Babel, and it's the first tyrant. The first tyrant that we know of that was named. And he builds this world kingdom, shaking his fist at God, and God comes down and judges him. Isn't it interesting that Babylon, that became the Tower of Babel or confusion? And we see Babylon again with Nebuchadnezzar. When he steps out, and what was he? A one world kingdom, right? I mean, he had conquered the world basically. And he says, look what I have done. Oh, Babylon, how great is Babylon? And then he built an image and said, you're going to bow down to that image or else I'm going to burn you in a furnace of fire. So that spirit of tyranny was going on. That spirit of, we don't need God. I don't believe in your God or need your God. You're going to bow to me. I'm the Almighty. Which is exactly what Nimrod was saying, according to Josephus. He said he gradually turned government into tyranny seeing no other way of making men turn from the fear of God, but by making them dependent on himself, government. Now that's an amazing quote that, we don't have time to really dig deep on that, but there's a lot right there. And I'm talking that was 4,500 years ago. Men trying to make the masses dependent on themselves so that they wouldn't be dependent on God. So that's tyranny. And that pops up in Genesis 11, and we see it all the way through to the book of Revelation with the Antichrist, who does the same thing. And Babylon pops up in Revelation, right? And what is it? It's a one world system with a political leader shaking his fist in God's face and trying to get everybody else to be mad at God too. So that's where this is all going. So go with me to Deuteronomy, if you would. So this thing of government, and again, we don't have time to go real deep, and you probably feel like I'm hitting you. You're trying to drink out of a fire hose right now. It's just a lot. But I'm just going to kind of lay it out here and give you some thoughts, and you can do more research later. But so here's the amazing thing. You got Pharaoh, again, another tyrant, world leader, biggest empire on earth. And what does God do? He says, I'm going to pull the children of Israel out of there. So they had been owned by this tyrant for 400 years. God pulls them out, and he begins to give them, he's going to give them freedom. But along with freedom comes responsibility. You can't handle freedom without some responsibility, without some boundaries, without some rules. Otherwise, it's destructive. So what are those boundaries? What's the first thing God did after he got them out into the wilderness? Mount Sinai. He begins to give them the law. No, wait, I thought he was leading them into freedom, out of slavery. He was, but they needed law to have freedom. So he gives them the commandments, and many of those commandments that he gave Moses are civil commandments. Like, okay, your brother just lied to you, or he cheated you in a contract, or whatever. Here's what you do, right? It's civil law. How do we be civil with each other? And that's what civilization is the art of getting along and trying to figure out how do we buy and sell and trade and work and live in a community. That's civics, right? The study of civics. And all it is trying to figure out, you're a sinful creature, selfish, and I'm a sinful, selfish creature. Now, how are we going to make this work? And so God gave Moses these laws directly from God. I mean, this is how you're going to treat foreigners. This is how you're going to, you're not going to lie to each other. You're going to honor your parents. You're going to, and he lays out the law. So now we've got, it's kind of like a ball game. You can't even play the game if you don't have some rules, right? I've got to know where the court is. What are the boundaries? How many points is a basket? What is a foul? What's not a foul? Once you've got the rules laid out, then you can get out there and start playing. And that's how life is. God gave them laws. Now, this is interesting because you've got God giving man law. Man is subject to that law, but it's kind of like referees. We have a hard time playing the game without referees. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just say, here's the rules, now go do it, right? And everybody just got out there on the court and obeyed the rules. We don't do that, do we? I mean, again, our sin nature, selfish, we're warped, we only see it our way, and we need, if we take the game seriously at all, we need referees. What are the referees? The referees understand the laws or the rules, and they've been hired to enforce them so that innocent people who are trying to play the game and do it right can keep going so the game doesn't break down. So you need these refs, and we had a Christian school for about 10 years, and I remember them coming and saying, we need to sign this check for the refs. And I remember looking at that number thinking, what? That's a big number. When you host a tournament, you got, my goodness. And I'm like, do we really need to do this? We'll try playing the game without the refs. Yeah, never mind. Let's write the check. because we can't handle it. We can't even handle a basketball game, let alone life. So you need refs. But here's the deal. The refs have two responsibilities. Know the rules, enforce the rules, right? That's it. It's pretty simple. We're not asking them to play the game. And we're not asking them to tip the scale so one team wins and the other team doesn't win. We're just asking them know the rules and then enforce them. If you'll do that, life will take care of the rest. We'll figure out who's good and who's not good and who needs more practice and who needs to listen to the coach more and who's going to set records. Life will take care of all that. We don't need you to dictate that. We just need you to know the rules and enforce them. That is a biblical picture of government. We need people who know the rules and will enforce it. And they're not picking favorites. They're not being biased. So we learn all of that through Israel. Okay? That's why in Washington, D.C., there are carvings of the Ten Commandments and Moses, because he is that original lawgiver that God gave the law through and became the foundation of civilization. And if you go to Deuteronomy, this is after the 40 years. I'll just point out a few things here. After the 40 years in the wilderness, they're getting ready to go into the promised land. Moses is getting ready to die or, move on. This is his last book that he would write. Look at chapter 1, and he's kind of reviewing what had happened over the 40 years. So he says in verse number 9, I spake unto you at that time, saying, I am not able to bear you myself alone. He was the only leader, the only referee, the only judge, and there was way too many people. Some folks think, 5 to 10 million people out there. And so here's Moses trying to be the judge in all of their civil disputes. Verse 10, the Lord hath multiplied you, and behold, you are this day as the stars of heaven for multitude. The Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times so many more as ye are, and bless you as he hath promised you. How can I myself alone bear your cumbrance and your burden and your strife? So here's what they came up with. And if you remember the story with Jethro, his father-in-law, and all that, this is what God led them to do. Verse number 13, take you wise men, understanding and known among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you. Now, if you look at that word rulers, it has the idea of a judge. It's not a pharaoh, it's not a dictator, it's not a lord. It's a judge. So he says, look around your congregation right now. Is there somebody in here that's wise, that has understanding, and that you know them, you trust them? Right? You've watched their life, you've watched their business. Then ask them if they would fill this role and be a ruler, a judge, a referee. So, verse 13, this is the idea of elected leaders. You're going to pick people, and collectively, you're going to have a vote, and you're going to say, okay, we all believe that this guy right here fits that description. And he's willing to do it, so we bring him to you, Moses. Okay, verse 14, ye answered me and said, the thing which thou hast spoken is good for us to do. So I took the chief of your tribes, wise men, known, and made them heads over you, captains over thousands. The word heads there means accountable. Okay, they're responsible for this district. And he says over thousands, captains over hundreds, captains over 50s, captains over 10s, officers among your tribes. So there's 12 tribes. And he broke the tribes down into thousands, hundreds, 50s, 10s. That's local government. That's instead of everything having to go to Moses, instead of everything going to Washington, D.C., you handle everything you can possibly handle right here. Right? So that's the principle. You elect people that you trust, that are wise. Not everybody can handle it. By the way, have you ever seen a bad referee? Well, of course. Because not everybody can handle it. But the good ones stick around because people want to hire them, right? If you have a bad ref, you just don't hire him anymore. I mean, you might fire him right in the middle of the game, but, probably wait till the end of the game and say, okay, we're not hiring you anymore. We'll get this other guy that can do it a lot better. Not everybody's cut out to be in government. Some are not that good at it. But some who are good deserve to be there, right? And it's actually a ministry, and we'll see that in Romans 13. So he says, you send these people, we're going to have them. If the guy over 10 can't handle it, then it bumps up to the guy with 50. If that region can't handle it, then it moves up to the hundreds, up to the 1,000. And if that can't handle it, then you come to me and I'll go to God and we'll get a final answer. But really, these guys aren't making up the law. The law's already been written. It's already been established. They're just saying, okay, that's what the law says, and this is what you two just did. Here's how we're going to make this work. We're going to interpret the law and apply it to this situation. And that's all a judge is. And for over 400 years, that's how Israel functioned, right? The book of Judges. And they started whining and complaining because every other nation has a king, and they wanted a king. Isn't it funny that you can have freedom under God, rule of law, and be doing just fine, and look around and say, yeah, but look at these socialist nations. Boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could be like them? Everybody else seems to be a socialist. Everybody else is a communist. Let's be like them. You know, it's just bizarre that you would leave the principles of freedom to go back under a king. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's amazing. Anyway, these principles here, verse 16, he says, I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the causes, listen to their dispute, judge righteously between every man and his brother and the stranger that's with him. You shall not respect persons in judgment. You shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. And so a lot there. Number one, it's the rule of law. Number two, it's justice is blind, right? Doesn't matter if this person is got a big name or lots of money. You ignore that and you look at the facts. You judge righteously. Then he also says, keep in mind that the judgment is God's. Because in the end, God knows what's right and wrong. You're just a ref that's going to give an account to the ref of refs, the King of Kings. I mean, you're just in this position for a little while, but you're going to die and stand before God, and to whom much is given, much is required. So if you're in this position of leadership, of authority, and you're over these people, you better get it right because you're going to stand before God. Do you realize that in America's founding days, they would make anyone that ran for office in these 13 original states, make them sign a document. Most of the states had at least these two things on it. Number one, I believe the Bible is divinely inspired, Old and New Testament. Number two, I believe there's a judgment day coming. Why did that matter? Because they wanted all these judges to know they're going to stand before God someday. This isn't about what you can get away with. This is about doing what is right because the judgment is the Lord's. They wanted to know that their elected leaders believed in an afterlife and that they're going to give an account to God. So, and that's all right here. The judgment is God's, and if the cause is too hard, bring it to me and I will hear it. Go with me to Romans, and we'll try to just wrap this up real quick. So, there's obviously a lot, and this is just an overview. But the whole concept of government was God's idea. Therefore, we ought to understand the principles, and we ought to be praying for these people, and we ought to be actively involved at keeping it out of Satan's hands. Because whatever government you have in your country, it's going to affect your home and it's going to affect your church. It's not like you can just focus on the other two and everything's going to be fine. That's not been the case for thousands of years. And what we enjoy in America is very unique. It's one gentleman wrote a book called The 5,000-Year Leap. For thousands of years, it was one way, tyrants. And then there was this leap and advancing the human cause. And it's because of these principles that we're going through right here. But look at Romans 13. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers. There's no power of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. So the word powers there has the idea of a kingdom or a realm of authority. And he's just saying, look, you be subject to the refs. It's kind of like me telling the kids before they go out on the ball court. The refs aren't perfect. They're going to make some mistakes. They're not going to call it the way you see it, but you're going to have honor. You're not slamming the ball on the floor. You're not going to have an attitude out there, right? We had that lecture with the kids. Why? Because sooner or later, they're not going to agree, but we're teaching them to respect the position, respect this structure that needs to be in place, or the whole game's going to break down. So you submit. And that's what verse 1 is saying. Look, your society is going to break down unless you submit. Verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power is actually resisting the ordinance of God, or the plan of God, the institution of God. This was his idea. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation or judgment. And that word judgment there means judgment by God or judgment by man. So you're going to give an account to God for breaking the rules, but you're also giving an account to the referees. And then verse number 3 puts limits on government. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. If they are judging according to the written law that was given down to us about how we ought to treat each other, biblical government doesn't go after good people. Biblical government does not go after pastors that are preaching the Word of God. Government does not go after missionaries that are trying to give the gospel to people, because God told them to do that. Godly government, biblical, actual, true government, doesn't go after parents who are trying to teach their kids and raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and make sure that they're in good schools or teach them at home or whatever the case, That's the whole thing of education was given to parents, wasn't it? Train up your child in the way they should go. You could make the case that the church educates because God put teachers in the church, right? Pastors, teachers, etc. But you're not going to find anywhere in here that God gave teaching or education to the government. The government's job is to protect you while you figure out how to educate your kids. To protect you while you go to church. They shouldn't be coming in here and threatening this congregation. They ought to be standing at the doors keeping evil out so you guys can have church. I mean, that's the biblical purpose of government. That's what God gave us. So in verse number 3, he says, rulers are not a terror to good works. They are a terror to evil. Of course, when you can't define evil anymore, then you don't know what the purpose of government is. Right? That's why you need a Judeo-Christian foundation to even know what evil is. But just go ahead, a couple more verses. Verse 4, he is the minister of God to thee for good. In other words, the highway patrolman is doing God's work whether he realizes it or not. If he is stopping evil and protecting innocent people, he's a minister of God. The jailer, the city police, the sheriff's department, the military, they're ministers of God. It hurts me to think that young people wouldn't consider going into the military because of all the junk that's going on in our nation. Because we need good, godly people all through that system. It's a calling, just like being a missionary, just like being a pastor. I really believe that. He says they're ministers of God. They're servants of God, doing God's work. If God gave us government, then God's going to call people into it to do it right and honor Him. And then he goes on in verse 5 basically and says, if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he bears not the sword in vain. God gave government the permission to use lethal force to get their job done. Absolutely. So when a soldier or a policeman has to kill somebody in the line of duty to protect freedom and to carry out their job, that's not murder. God gave them permission. He said man is so evil, these guys are going to have to be able to use the sword. Then he says, he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Then he says in verse 5, wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Don't just do it, don't submit to the refs just because they're going to get onto you if you do wrong, but do it because it's the right thing to do. That you have a clean conscience. I got out there, I played the game, I followed the rules. Now, there's a difference when they're telling you to do something opposite of what God said, then you no longer obey. So that Paul and the guys who even wrote these scriptures died because their government said, you can't preach anymore. And they said, I'm sorry, God told us to preach. We're going to preach. You guys just figure out what you got to do. But I am not obeying that one. If government tells you to do something opposite of what God said, there's no question. We ought to obey God rather than man. Whatever the consequences. You render to Caesar what's Caesar's. We need those refs. But you render to God what is God's. And Caesar is not God. So when you get it all in the right perspective, it all begins to make sense. And I'll close out with one more thing. Verse 6, for this cause pay tribute, for they are God's ministers attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fair to whom fair, honor to whom honor. Tribute is taxes. And he's basically saying, pay your taxes because you need good police officers, highway patrolmen, military, judges, the whole judicial system. You need that. So pay your taxes because you don't want those guys farming on the side. You want them continually serving 24/7. And they deserve to be paid. That's what taxes are supposed to go for, not for everything else. And isn't it a bizarre world when we want to defund police, defund the military, so that we can pay for all this other stuff that's not true government? Interesting, isn't it? All right, let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for this time, for your word. Help us. We need you. Give us wisdom to know how to apply this truth in our day. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.